Hello. In this video, I am going to demonstrate to you how to include in your financial forecasting model the operating cash flows that we would use for capital budgeting purposes. I know that for some of you, you may not have yet got to the discussion about capital budgeting, and I will, in separate videos, be discussing the conceptual things that we need to know as it relates to capital budgeting. But for now, we're just going to focus on the applied in this video. So remember that for capital budgeting purposes, there are really three sets of cash flows we care about. There are the investment outlays. So whether that happens in period one or you have to do reinvestments later on, you want those to be picked up. There are the operating cash flows themselves. And then at the end of your forecast, you have to do something in terms of deciding what's going to happen with the cash flows that go on afterwards. So either you're shutting it down and you'll have some sort of terminal cash flow from liquidating everything, or you're going to make some assumption about it going on into perpetuity and you'll get a value there. And again, I'm not going to really go into the theory related to the terminal value in this, but I will show you how we would implement it. So in terms of the investment outlays, one of the key things as it relates to capital budgeting is that we don't make any assumptions about how things are financed. And so what we're looking for are what is the investment that we need to initially put in. And for us, that is simply the initial cash flow for investing. And of course, it's a negative. Now, optional, different people treat this differently. If you are assuming that you're going to need some cash for purposes of startup, you may want to add that. If you'll go back up and look at us, we assumed that we would have $62,000 in the cash account at startup. Now, we made some assumption about where we would get that money, but nonetheless, we basically assumed that we're putting in $62,000. And so in our case, what you would want to do is to go ahead in that one instance and somehow include that total amount that we're sticking in the current assets account. And so we're going to go ahead and say that it's that minus this 62,000. If I can get this to scroll, there we go. Okay. And that's our initial investment. And for the months after that, we can extend that to the right, but we're not going to keep picking up the 62,000. So we'll take that out because we don't need an extra 62,000. Remember, these are cash flows. And so we can start to extend that to the right just whenever we want. Okay. Then in terms of net income, or in terms of operating cash flows, what we want is we want the net income up top, and we want to add back both non-cash charges and interest expenses. Non-cash charges, the same reason as we did with free cash flows. It's not really cash going out as an expense. We want to put it back in. In this case, we're adding back the interest expenses because for capital budgeting purposes, you're not making any assumptions that you've borrowed money. You're just assuming it's all equity financed initially, in the cash flows. And if there were a use of debt, you would reflect that in your cost of capital. It would be double counting to both charge the project in the numerator for interest expenses and then charge it in the terms of a discount rate in the denominator. You'd be double penalizing them for the interest. So we got to add that back. Then we also have to add back the non-cash working capital. Catch here is, again, even though it's not explicit, we can't add back in working capital impacts of debt, so short-term borrowing. So we need to just go ahead and add back other things other than that. And so you'll see we'll build all of that up. So net income, I'm just going to go ahead and grab the net income that we use in the free cash flows. It's fine. Same thing, I'm going to add back the depreciation amortization. In terms of the interest, I'm going to go grab that up top. Interest expense. Hardest part about this is always making sure that you stay in the right column, it seems like. Okay, so what's my current non-cash working capital non-debt? It is equal, when we go up for my particular example, current assets that aren't cash, so that accounts receivable plus inventory. And then if we had any current liabilities, we'd subtract those. We don't, so in my case, it's just those two things. Prior period was just 0, so I'm going to enter that for now. Current this time, I can extend over to the next period. Prior is equal to last time's current. I know that's a little bit of quick, but there we go. And then the change is equal to current minus prior. So we'll do that. And then importantly, just like last time, because this is a less, I'm going to go ahead and put a minus sign in front of it. There we go. Not quite sure what happened there. I thought I had it, but oh well. All right. And so as we extend over, let's see how this goes as we move to the right a little bit. And so what you'll see is, of course, the net income when we get it. You'll see we have a couple of months where there's really no operating cash flows at all. Now, again, I can always go back in and change that and assume that we are going to have some labor and all that sort of stuff then. I just don't have it right now, but the formula is set up properly for it. So we don't have any interest expense or anything because we do that on a yearly basis at this point. And you'll see this is a little bit different. We don't have this non-cash working capital here like we do in the free cash flows, but we do have sort of all of the others, so that makes sense. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say that the operating cash flows are equal to the sum of all of these down to here. We don't want to count the two rows that are the current and prior working capital because they're just there to help us solve for the value. All right. And again, can't say this enough. The reason that all works is because we have, where there's a less, we've put a minus sign in front of it. And so if you don't do that, then you wind up with this thing being sort of screwy. All right. So now that we've got it, we can just take that whole thing and extend it all the way out to the right. Okay, and that gets us in the range. There we go. Not a bad result. But now we need a terminal value. And so the first thing you have to think about terminal value is what percent you're going to assume. And so we're going to assume as a discount rate, we're going to assume 10% for now. We may adjust that later on, but for now, we're just going to plug that in so I can show you how this calculates out. All right. And what we want to do, when you do a terminal value, we're going to rely on a formula that some of you may learn about a little bit later, but basically the terminal value is assuming that we have this cash flow going into perpetuity. And so it's in perpetuity, we just take the last year's cash flow and we divide by whatever our discount rate is minus whatever our growth rate is. Well, in our case, the growth rate is simply inflation because we've stopped growing the number of customers. The only reason that anything's growing at all now is because of inflation. So we would solve the terminal value as simply equal to the last period cash flow divided by that 10% minus, we've got up here our assumption about inflation somewhere. Where is it? Here we go. 2%. And there we go. And so that terminal value in our case is 3.4 million. That is basically the value, given the path of cash flows that we have, that someone would be willing to pay at the end of year 10 for this business to have the right for all the cash flows in the future, under the assumption that they thought that 10% was a good discount rate, and that it was really just going to grow at inflation from here on out at 2%. So I know that we did not cover a lot of the theory in here. This is really just the applied part of it. But if you're wondering how to sort of pull something like this together, once you've heard all of the theory, this is the example of how you do it. I hope that was useful.